what do I think went wrong with Swain's update? Are you talking about how it's like kind of underpowered right now? If I was to like look at, if I was to like look at the Swain update, and say like something that would be worth thinking about on it, it's the concept of pushing power. And so what I mean by that is, oftentimes when you're making a character or a thing in a game, there are certain things that must feel powerful and must feel abusive and must feel crazy. And one of the dangers of balancing a game is that it's very easy to see something that feels powerful or strong and be like, that was too strong. Clearly that's not balanced, then perhaps nerf it, right? But there are some things on a character that you're supposed to look at it and be like, that feels broken, and it is broken, and that's intended, and to make up for it, -5 health per level. And so like an example of this would be like, if we were to balance Warwick, one of the things we could do, let's say Warwick was like, doing a thing, like if we were to balance Warwick, one of the things we could do is be like, isn't it kind of crazy that when like Warwick Qs you, he just heals to full, and then like we could nerf the heal some amount, right? But at the same time, it's the point of Warwick that when he Qs you, he heals to full, right? Like that's his thing. That's like one of his things, right? If we're balancing, say, Jinx, I actually get this a lot on stream where people will be like, August, why did you buff Jinx's passive? Jinx like gets her passive and she pops off and kills everybody, and then it stacks and she pops off and kills everybody even more, and like, isn't that unfair? Isn't that crazy? And it's like, well, but the point of Jinx's passive in that moment is to make her feel unreasonable. Like when I say unreasonable, I don't mean like the character can't have counterplay or things like that, but like what I'm getting at is like that's supposed to be a very, 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 very powerful moment for her. In relation to Swain, I would wonder if there's a few things in the update that, have potential to be really powerful and really fun and really satisfying, but perhaps the power on them isn't pushed enough. Meaning like, those are the things that should feel OP. And then again, if he's actually OP, it's like maybe he gets 5 less health per level, or maybe a certain spell does less damage or something like that. And so, as an example with Swain, it's like he can cast multiple ults, right? That's cool. But the cooldown on it right now, I would argue, I would guess, is perhaps a bit too restrictive, such that how often are you actually getting 2 casts? How often are you getting 3 casts, right? And that might be too hard. And maybe that's supposed to be something that's like really, really crazy on him, right? Maybe that's supposed to be his E. Like, it's like, his E is fast and is more fast, it's more reliable, that can potentially feel good. Like, how often are you supposed to cast that? How strong is it supposed to be when it hits? Things like that. And so I'm not going to say like anything that should or shouldn't be done with Swain, but it feels like perhaps there is supposed to be something that the power should be pushed more on, so that it can feel, stronger and legitimately more unfair. But then, like, again, characters are allowed to do unfair things in moments as long as they overall are balanced and overall have counterplay. And it's a potential that just sometimes when we're making characters, we can be maybe too conservative on some of the outputs. And I do this all the time with characters I work on. It's like, when I release some characters, I'll be like, oh, I thought that would be stronger than it ended up being, and it was supposed to be pretty strong, and maybe I should buff it up in the future. Like, as an example, JHIN, actually, as an example. One of the changes I actually really liked that we did to JHIN, this is like a very simple one, but I think I'm really glad that we did it years later, is we buffed both his W, root duration, and his captive audience in just a number of ways. Captive audience, like specifically like the recharge on it. And the reason I like that we did these changes on JHIN, so JHIN, when he shipped, this root duration on W is 0.75 seconds. And when he shipped, like people legitimately wouldn't put points into captive audience. Like there was builds on JHIN where you wouldn't put a point in this, and it was like, don't put a point in this spell, it's a trap. Haha, get it? Anyways, but the way that these things got there is that they were doing OP things. Sorry, things that were easy to perceive as being OP, and we just ended up nerfing them until they just weren't as good. And so, like, as an example, Jin's Deadly Flourish should be good for rooting you. Because, like, that's the point, right? He has this, like, really long-range root. That's special, right? But when he came out, it was only 0.75 seconds at early game. And so while it definitely eventually scaled to a point of being pretty good at rooting you, early on, like, you could cast it and you would root yourself as much as you rooted your opponents. And so that was a place where it's like, in the long term, I think we didn't push the power on the root enough, given what the spell was supposed to be, and I'm glad we eventually got there. And then again, it's like maybe then we nerf his Q damage if he's OP, right? And specifically Captive Audience, we had this feedback cycle on JHIN that I think ended up being, you know, not as ideal in hindsight, and this was my fault as a designer, is whenever somebody gave me feedback about JHIN's E, I was like, well, probably shouldn't do that. So someone was like, it did too much damage. And I was like, okay, I'll nerf the damage. And then someone was like, it slowed me too much. And I was like, okay, I'll nerf the slow. And then someone was like, it's up too often. And I was like, okay, I'll make it not up very often. And then somebody was like, it lasts too long. And so I was like, okay, I'll make it last less time. And then someone was like, it gives too much sight radius. And I was like, okay, I'll make it give too much sight radius. And like, the thing about a feedback cycle like that is it can often feel right in the moment, but like everything needs to be good at something, right? Like things need to have a purpose. And so what I ended up screwing up on JHIN when I was working on him for this E is that I never really put a stake in the ground for what his E should be good at. Flux, it's not a cosplay. True, I am a doctor. I'm the real doctor. Hey, cutie kitten. Not this cosplay? What's wrong with this cosplay? And so anyways, whenever someone told me like, hey, this looks too powerful, I was like, you're right. It is too powerful. It shouldn't do that. But like, in hindsight, what would have been better for me to do as JHIN's designer when I was working on this trap is define something about this trap that was really, really, really good. And so it's like, as an example, in the long run, one of the things we did is we were like, you know what should be good about JHIN's trap, since, again, when it came out, it wasn't very powerful. In the long run, one of the things we did is we buffed the trap duration. Because we were like, you know what? We're okay with JHIN's trap being a decent for warding things. Like, if you're putting a bunch of traps in a bush, you're allowed to do that. That can be something it's good at. Because when I was making JHIN, I'd get a lot of feedback of like, these are good for warding. That's strong. And I'd be like, you're right, that's strong, and it probably shouldn't be good for that. So I nerfed it to only 2 minutes, and like, you know, after we shipped him, we buffed it. A few years after we shipped him, because it was like, hey, actually, maybe that should be good for warding. And so yeah, sorry. Tying it all back, it is very often important that characters have certain things on them where the power is pushed in a way that a player is like, yeah, that's really, really, really strong. And then again, we compensate with weaknesses elsewhere, downsides elsewhere, tuning elsewhere. And so with Swain, a question I would ask in my head is, we did a lot of cool things with the update to him. We gave him power in new ways, and you know, like multiple ult casts, like a faster E, things like that. And perhaps the power of those buffs that we did isn't pushed enough to the point where it's like, oh yeah, and this is really good, and this is like what I'm going to be doing that's really strong in this moment. And so that's perhaps a thought about it I might have.